Hello, everybody. Good moed, good evening. And thank you so much for joining me tonight for the final shir in our series of Lishmoa Ela Rinavi Ela Tfila, experiencing Tishrei through the music of Torah. I would like to, once again this evening, begin by thanking our generous sponsors, Rachel and Chaim Edelbaum and family, who have generously sponsored this entire series in memory of Lorraine Vogel, Liba Devora, Bas Aaron Shimon, Aleha Shalom. We thank them very much and hope that, in fact, this entire Shir series was meaningful not just to them, but served as a proper zikaron to their dear mother and grandmother. So this is hard to believe that we are finally at the end of what has been really a very interesting experience. I would say a meaningful journey. Received who have been fans of Yishai Ribo and now are bigger fans, and those who were not as familiar with his music but now have since become a little more interested. So that's certainly, as far as I'm concerned, that's great to hear. Tonight we're going to end the series with a song that is probably one of his most popular songs. I'm not sure that it is necessarily most popular among those who are listening tonight, and I really don't know to what extent the number of hits any song has on YouTube is an indicator as to how popular a song is. But whereas I think Seder Avoda, we said, had about 26 million views, so this one has over 40 million. So clearly, it's a very popular song. Now, it could be it's because it's an older song. It's about 2 years older. That could be. Now, the song "לשוב הביתה" is, I think, very, very fitting for this series in general, as the song really is about tshuva. And so therefore, we really could have started the series by discussing the song. Literally, it means to return home. That is the theme of this song. But I wanted to end the series with the song because I really think it has a message embedded within it, which is just as appropriate, if not more, at the end of the Tishrei season than perhaps it would have been in the beginning. And that is about how to take all of the inspiration, so much of that which we have been able to think about and pray for over the past month plus, and to bring that back into our homes. Now, of course, it is still Sukkot. Today is Hoshana Rabbah. And being that it's the last day of Sukkot, we still are going to spend one additional day in the Sukkah. And even on Shmini Atzeres, which is technically no longer Sukkot, we also, spend, even if it's informally, additional time in the Sukkah. But ultimately, this season is coming to an end, and we are going to be literally returning to our homes. So I thought that this would be an appropriate song to reflect upon. Tonight, we are not going to analyze the lyrics quite as extensively as we have in the past. I'm going to begin, as we always have, with playing the song, and you will have the lyrics in front of you, both in Hebrew and English. And it's all there for you to unpack, not only tonight, but at your leisure. And when the song's over, we're going to try to focus a little bit on some of the important themes from this song. So please enjoy.
הגיע הזמן להתעורר, לעזוב הכל, להתגבר, לשוב הביתה. לא לחפש מקום אחר, להשתנות, גם אם פספסנו תחנות, אפשר לרדת, יש רכבת, חזרה לשכונות. הכל אפשר רק אם נרצה, המחפש תמיד מוצא, גם אם הוא נמצא, ישר מרחק בקצה. דלתות שמיים לא ננעלו, כשהבן קורא הצילו, אבא שבשמיים מגיע אפילו שעשינו משהו רע. הוא מוחל וסולח, מושיט ידו לעזרה, ונותן ברחמיו את הכוח לתקן ולשוב אליו. הגיע הזמן להתחרט, אם כבר לברוח אז מאחת, אם כבר לקחת אז לקחת בשביל לתת. וזה הזמן להתקרב, לא לפחד מהכאב, ואם לתת אז כבר לתת מכל הלב. הכל אפשר רק אם נרצה, מחפש תמיד מוצא, גם אם הוא נמצא שם הרחק בקצה. כתות שמיים לא ננעלו, כשהבן קורא הצילו, אבא שבשמיים מגיע אפילו שעשינו משהו רע. הוא מוחל וסולח, מושיט ידו לעזרה, ונותן ברחמה את הכוח לתקן ולשוב. אפילו שעשינו משהו רע, הוא מוחל וסולח, מושיט ידו לעזרה, ונותן ברחמה את הכוח לתקן ולשוב אליו. הגיע הזמן להתעורר, לעזוב הכל, להתגבר, לשוב הביתה.
Okay, so there you have it. The song לשוב הביתה, which is, as I mentioned before, for one of the most amazing is that while the song does, as you can clearly see, reference some very, very important reflections and thoughts of Chazal, and perhaps many paraphrased quotations from the Siddur. This is a song which is also accessible to the masses, and I think that I've heard and I've seen some very, very powerful displays of real, of joyous and meaningful song and connection from people all over Israel. And again, most importantly, most remarkably, and most significantly, even among those who are not yet necessarily spending their time in shul, engaged in formal acts of tshuva. But this song, לשוב הביתה, which is about the return home, which is clearly understood as a metaphor in the context of this song about doing tshuva and returning to the home in the broadest of senses. So this is something that I think speaks to lots and lots of people. So what I would like to do with our time tonight is to really reflect on this message, first of all, by anchoring ourselves in where we are right now. It is now sort of the end of the Yom Tov of Sukkot, and we are nearing the end of all of the holidays that started in the beginning of the month of Tishrei. And also, then sort of segue a little bit into a conversation about the importance of home in general, and what we may mean when we speak about the importance of the bias. Leshuv habayta, to return home, can mean many, many different things. And I think it is intended, as far as this particular song is concerned, to reflect several different ideas. Now, we know that we have been saying now for almost a week that Sukkot is Zman Simchasenu. It is the time of our happiness, the time of our joy. When you think of it, it's a little bit of a strange expression to use, because when it comes to the other holidays, so we are very specific as to what exactly it is that we are joyous about. So when it comes to Pesach, for example, we say it is Zman Cherusenu. It is the time where we celebrate our freedom, because after all, it is the anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Similarly, Shavuos is identified as Zman Matan Torasenu, because it is the time that we celebrate the anniversary of having received the Torah, the moment of Maimon Har Sinai. Regarding Sukkot, the focus of our joy is not as clear. Of course, the Torah stresses Simcha on Sukkot more so than by any other holiday, but it's not as clear, it's not as explicit as to what exactly it is that we are celebrating. Of course, there's a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva as to what the object of our kavanah should be when we are sitting in the sukkah, and even that ambiguity, points to and highlights the fact that the Torah is unusually vague about what it is that we are celebrating. But the fact almost to skirt the issue entirely, we keep saying that we're happy, but what are we happy about? We're not really sure, and we don't explicitly mention it at any point in our davening. So the question is, what's going on over here? So I think that it may be helpful to think for a moment about what simcha means. I think that many of us sometimes confuse the word simcha with, let's say, another word which is similar and sometimes used in conjunction with the word simcha, and that is a word like sason. Sason is a word that we would probably translate as joy. Simcha, we would say, maybe means happiness. What is the difference between simcha and sason? For example, joy and happiness. So it's not so simple to say that simcha just means to be festive and joyous in the most simple sense of celebrating. And the reason I say that is because we have several examples in which Chazal use the word simcha, and it is clear that what they are describing over there is a state of being, an emotional state of being, which is not, doesn't seem on the surface to be something which is about an actual festive celebration. So, for example, perhaps one of the best examples would be the Gemara in Brachos of Samach Amid Beis tells us that just as a person recites a bracha, kishem shemavarech ala ra kach mevarech ala tov. A person is supposed to recite a bracha on good news, on bad news rather, just as they make a bracha on good news. So the Gemara wants to know, what exactly does that mean? If you're going to tell me it's the same bracha, well, it's not the same bracha, because the Gemara tells us that we learn in the Mishnah that Abasuros Tovos, when we hear good tidings, good news, we recite the bracha Vatova Meitiv, and Abasuros Raos, on bad news, there's a different bracha, Baruch Daina Emes. So what does it mean when it says Kishem, just as, so too? So says the Gemara, Lo nitzche ela lekublinu b'simcha. The Gemara says that when we recite the bracha of Daina Emes, we should recite that bracha b'simcha, just as we recite the bracha of Hatova Meitiv b'simcha. Now, clearly, this cannot mean joy. It's inconceivable. It doesn't make sense that Chazal would be directing us to recite the bracha Tova Meitiv mamish b'simcha in a state of joy, that we should be dancing and singing. It is true the Gemara does have references that says that if we could think about things in the most sort of idealistic sense of and perspective, we would recognize that at moments of tragedy in life, there's another fuller perspective that we can have. But as human beings, who are, of course, limited in terms of our perspective, we can't muster, nor should we, I believe, the emotional strength and energy to be able to recite the Baruch Daina Emes in a state of joy. So what does it mean when the Gemara says we should say the bracha b'simcha? So Rashi tells us in that Gemara, what does that mean? Levarech amidas pranios b'leivav shalem. Says Rashi that when we recite a bracha, hatov v'ametiv, and meaning, even though we are reflecting upon midas pranios, which means about events in this world that are tragic, and events that really seem to upset us and disturb us and leave us feeling afraid and disappointed and sad and vulnerable. Nevertheless, we should recite this bracha b'leivav shalem. B'leivav shalem means with a sense of emotional tranquility, that we should at the very least acknowledge that even though this is very upsetting to me, even though this is disturbing and I can't be truly joyous at this time, I could say it with a frame of mind in which I remind myself that everything in the world happens for a reason, and that there's a purpose to everything in the world, not only celebrations, but even suffering. And with that perspective, so that's what it means to say something b'simcha. We see that there's a similar Gemara, perhaps. The Gemara in Pesachim tells us, based on the pasuk that we say every day, multiple times. The Navi Zechariah tells us, "V'haya Hashem l'melech ha'kol ha'aretz," that Hashem will become the king over the entire world. Bayom hahu, on that day, Hashem hachodesh ma'achad. God will be literally one, and His name will be one. Says the Gemara, "Atu idna lav echadu." What today He's not one, only one in the future. So the Gemara explains, no, there's a difference between where we are now and where we will be be'ezras Hashem in the future. Ba'olam haba. In olam hazeh, Abasuros tovos baruch atov hametiv. When we hear good news, we say atov hametiv, and on bad news, we say adayin emes. L'olam haba, in the future world, in the world to come, kulu atov hametiv. Everything will be tov hametiv. So how do we understand that? How could we ever say hatov hametiv on something which is truly bad? So the Gemara seems to be saying is that in olam hazeh, which means from our perspective at the moment, it is difficult, if not impossible, to have the full picture in mind. And so therefore, when we see events unfold around us, they lead us to either feeling a sense of happiness and joy and optimism, and we're happy as to what's going on. And then there are other times where things happen and they're quite upsetting and very, very disturbing, leaving us feeling very concerned and worried and afraid and sad and depressed. But we recognize that the only reason we are looking at things that way is because we have a limited perspective, because from where we are right now, we can't really see the big picture. And the Gemara is telling us that there will be a time that we'll be able to look at all events in the world through a prism of greater clarity. And we will be able to recognize with more conviction, not just belief, but our perspective will be broadened so that we will be able to see things from such a clear perspective, and everything will be more barur. Things will be clearer than they are today. And as a result, we will be able to recite the bracha when I was Menachem Avel. This goes back well over 20 years, maybe 25 years, but I remember the image in my mind very, very clearly. There was somebody who had experienced a terrible personal tragedy, and in the Beis Avel, in an attempt to comfort those who were visiting her, ironically, she shared a very powerful mashal. She said that this world is like it's like a needlepoint, a tapestry where, when you look at the back, it looks like a big mess. You just see, strings that are just hanging, disconnected, disjointed one from the other. You do see patterns of color, but for the most part, it they don't sort of blend naturally one into the other. You certainly don't see full pictures, and it just leaves you, wondering, where's the art in this? Where's the beauty in this? It looks like a very, very poor attempt at creating a beautiful piece of art. And then when you turn it over and you look at the front, what we typically see when we see, this art hanging on the wall. So it comes to life in such a beautiful way. Suddenly, everything fits together perfectly. Everything is neat. Everything is where it's supposed to be. We don't see these loose ends, and we don't see strings that are sticking out, and we don't see clashes between colors. And most importantly, we see pictures. We see how all of a sudden everything sort of comes together in a really amazing way. And then once again, when you look at the other side of it, so it looks like a mess. And what she had suggested was that in this world where we are right now, when we see things from a very skewed perspective. We're not able to see the big picture. And so therefore, we have no choice but to look at these events and to acknowledge that we don't understand it all. And it leaves us feeling pretty upset and depressed. And so therefore, we cite the bracha of Dayan Emes, acknowledging the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what he's doing. But yet the Gemara says when we say that bracha, we should say it b'simcha. We should say it b'simcha because we believe, even if we don't necessarily understand it on our mind, we believe in our heart that there is a purpose to everything. And even the suffering in life is functional. And therefore, as Rashi says, we recite a bracha, midas pranios, b'leiv of shalem, with that same sense of conviction that it is coming from God. So I saw in the Sefer Shiurei Das of one of the previous Rosh Yeshiva, the Telz Yeshiva, of Elia Meir Blach, that he explains that with this we can understand and appreciate what Sukkot is all about, Zman Simchaseinu. He says, all year round, we are basically very limited in terms of our perspective. We have a very, again, as I just sort of explained, a very skewed perspective on what's going on in the world. But during the Yamam Naraim, we are able to hopefully raise ourselves to a much higher spiritual level. We daven and we dream of a very glorious future, and which all of mankind will recognize and appreciate the greatness and omniscience of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We daven of v'chein tzadikim yiru v'yismachu v'simlo Hashem levadecha b'har tziyom shkan kavadecha, and still on this high, we are able to appreciate emotionally, even if it's a pretty small level, that everything that happens in the world is really good, and there's a divine purpose in everything. It's as if we have climbed this very, very tall mountain, and for a short time we remain on top of that mountain, and we're able to look down and sort of appreciate the full, beautiful view below. And so therefore he suggests that on Sukkot, we don't specify the source of our simcha because there's no need to. When do we say that we are happy about something in particular? When our perspective is limited, when there's only so much that we can see and no more. So then we say, okay, I'm happy about this and I'm happy about this. Zman Chayreseinu, Zman Matan Toraseinu. But on Sukkot, we do not discriminate. We do not distinguish between different types of events because being that it is Chag HaAsif, it is the time in which we gather in literally the harvest, but everything, all of creation, everything that happens in the world brings us joy. We don't have to specify as we do on Pesach and Shavuos where our joy comes from, because there is nothing in this world. There is nothing in this world which detracts in any way or distracts us from the source of our joy on Sukkot. And this idea enables us to achieve completely new insight and perspectives into many aspects of the holiday of Sukkot. So, for example, the Daled Minim represent 4 different types of Jews, right? There's an idea that the esrog, which has a good taste and a good smell, represents people who have Torah and mitzvos, both tam and reach. And we take the hadassim, and we take the lulav, and even the aravos, which are lacking in tam and reach, which represent Jews that are unfortunately, not yet living a life in which they reflect the values of Torah living and Torah learning. Nevertheless, we bring this all together. We bind them all together, and we say, Kulo tova meitiv. Everything is wonderful. Everything's good. We're not only focusing on that which appears on the surface to be positive. The sukkah, which Chazal tell us represents the galus, exile, is a source of great joy on the Yom Tov of Sukkot. We bring karbanos not only for ourselves, but for the 70 nations, all of the nations, which represent, including those with whom we are still engaged in conflict. We bring sacrifices on their behalf, demonstrating that we place no limits or boundaries on the scope of our celebration over Sukkot. On Sukkot, we have a special component of Simcha that happened in the Beis HaMikdash, specifically around the Nisuch HaMayim and the celebrations of Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Generally speaking, Chazal tell us, "Ein omim shira ela ala yayin." It requires wine, which is something which is of greater value and meaning in order to generate feelings of Simcha. But on Sukkot, everything brings us joy. And Mayim, water, which has no taste or substance, it is bland, it is plain, it is something that we don't even recite a bracha on if we're taste to it, and so therefore it doesn't carry the same chashivas as other beverages would. But nevertheless, on Sukkot, it serves as a catalyst for tremendous joy and happiness. To the extent that Chazal tell us that if you didn't see the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, so lo ra simcha miyamav, there was something truly exalted about that experience. So, in order to properly appreciate this Simchas HaAsid, so what do we need to do? We need to leave the comfort of our homes and to go into the sukkah. We temporarily extricate ourselves from a world which is a bit of a facade, in which we imagine often what it is that's real and what's not, but it's a confusing world. And we leave the sort of deceptive permanence of our homes, and we let go of the very damaging illusions that block our inner eye from being able to see God's presence. And we move into the sukkah. And when we're in the sukkah, we are able to feel a greater sense of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because there is nothing that is separating, so to speak, between us and our natural environment. We sit under the stars, hopefully in a place where we can appreciate with greater clarity the concepts of Hashgacha Pratis, the idea that Kol Davar Rachmana L'Tavavid. It is easier to feel the sense of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we are in the sukkah. But there's only one problem with this. It's wonderful, but it's not real in the sense that it's not sustainable. Ultimately, Sukkot comes to an end. Ultimately, Tishrei comes to an end. And what do we have to do? We have to go back into our homes. And so he suggests that the goal of Shmini Atzeres, where the Torah tells us, "B'yom hashmini Atzeres tiyeh lachem," which could be understood as meaning stop, just stop, is that basically the Torah is saying now we have to take all of this and figure out how to live it, how to live that level of inspiration, not in the sukkah, but in our homes. And again, if you go back to the words of the song, Lashov Habaita, as Yishai Ribo expresses very beautifully, that, he compares life to a journey, many stops along the way. He even uses the famous metaphor of being sort of a train ride in which we're going from one place to another. And we make mistakes along the way and we lose our way. We get lost. And ultimately, the song is about coming home, which again could be understood in many, many different ways. But I think that the idea of returning home, coming home, is very, very much what the message of Shmini Atzeres is all about. Because we are essentially, really literally being told, okay, it's time to leave the very nurturing environment of the sukkah, home and forget everything. But to the contrary, let's figure out how to take so much of that inspiration for the month of Tishrei and infuse it within our lives, dafka, when we are in our homes. So over, I would say, the past couple of years, we have had a very unusual opportunity to consider, perhaps in ways that we haven't before, the difference between what we do at home and what we do in other, perhaps traditionally more familiar places and spaces, such as shuls and schools, areas of public assemblage, etc. And the reason for that is because for a pretty sustained period of time, we were unable to gather in these places. In the early months of the COVID pandemic, we were forced to basically close our shuls and come home. And for many people, but especially and most significantly for a frum Jew who recognizes and appreciates the centrality of our holy spaces and places, who realizes the concept of the kedusha of a Beis HaKnesses, Beis Medrash, and suddenly there were so many things that we couldn't do. There were places that we couldn't go. We couldn't access these Devarim Shebekdusha. So on the surface, this was truly unfortunate, and it was very distressing, undoubtedly, as it should be. But, every crisis is also an opportunity. And hopefully, we all took a moment or two during that period of time that we could not be in our shuls and our schools to think about the power of being at home. And even though, thankfully, we are now no longer limited to our homes and we are able to return back to our shuls and schools, etc., it is hopefully still fresh enough in our minds that we can appreciate and we can think about some of the important experiences and values that we were able to reflect upon dafka when we were in our home. About a year or two ago, and I remember sometime after this started, someone showed me something I'd never seen before. I have the volume of Choriv, actually, it's right behind me, of Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's Sefer, and in the introduction, so it's written over there that if I had the power, I would close all synagogues for 100 years. Can you imagine why it is that a giant such as Rav Hirsch, someone of his stature, would say such a thing? After a few days and weeks and months, certainly, we were all going out of our minds. We needed to get back to shul. And here, Rav Hirsch is quoted of having said, if I could, I would close all shuls for 100 years. We'll come back to that quote in a few minutes. But let's just think about the Jewish home for a moment. The heart, the control center, if you will, of the Jewish people was once the home more than it is today. The centrality of the home, if you think about it, at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, where there were so many mitzvos that were connected to the home. And then ultimately the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, which were never intended to be replacements of the home, even though these were places where people would gather in public. But ultimately, the Jewish people were founded upon principles of the importance of the Jewish home. The Jewish people are described as the Beis Yaakov, as the house of Yaakov, in the opening pasuk of Sefer Shemos, and the Sefer concludes by a reference to Beis Yisrael. In other words, the goal of Sefer Shemos, which is a story not just of the redemption of the Jewish people, but really transforming the Jewish people into a nation in which God's presence can dwell, was about how to transform the Jewish home into a place worthy of the divine presence. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos teaches, Yosi ben Yoezer ish tzrei de omer, yehe beischa beis vad l'chachamim, that we should try to turn our homes into a beis vad l'chachamim. And the Mefarshim of Pirkei Avos try to explain exactly what that means. What is a beis vad l'chachamim? Literally, we would say probably like a meeting place, an assembly place for chachamim, for wise people. But basically, what they all more or less say is that there should be a place in which, even though it may not be technically in the most formal sense, a beis medrash, a shul, yeshiva, our home should operate and function in a way in which it attracts wise people and values wisdom, that our homes should be such a place. And what's really interesting is that many of us think about our homes as being places where we go to take care of sort of our own personal business. And when we are looking for an infusion of spirituality, so we go to those places. And over here, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos is sort of redirecting us and saying, wait, hold on one second. Yehi beischa beis vad l'chachamim. You're home. And it's not necessarily intended to be a substitute for the shul, but nor is the shul supposed to be a substitute for the home. That there are very, very important experiences that we can accomplish at home that we cannot necessarily accomplish in yeshiva. And for those of you who are able to reflect with any degree of positive memories upon the early days of the COVID pandemic, while it was very unsettling and very disruptive and to a certain extent very frightening, many individuals found very and very formative being able to spend time davening at home and reading from the Torah on Shabbos morning at home and doing things at home that we traditionally do in shul. Now, I don't mean to suggest, nor do I believe, that was ideal, that's not something we should strive for, or that's something that we should try to continue to access in that way. But at the same time, it behooves us to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, why is that so? What was so enlightening about those experiences? Why were we able to feel something and to achieve something that seemed so unique and so meaningful in a way that we hadn't before? So some of the answers may be because we would just, we noticed things we never noticed before. We weren't distracted to the same extent that we were. And just whenever you sort of change things up, it's naturally going to be just sort of a new experience. But I believe that there's something additional here, which is very relevant. And that is that we were able to achieve and to tap into opportunities for Kedusha and for holy moments of reflection in our own home, which is something that we were not doing, or at least not expanding the possibilities. There would be certain formal moments, Kiddush and Havdalah, these are things that we do in the home. But when we daven and when we learn to a certain extent, and when there are shiurim that are taking place, when we learn from the Torah, these are things that happen in shul. But that's a mistake, because what then happens is we live almost sort of like a little bit of a double life, in which we are one way in the shul and another way in the home. And ultimately, the goal of Avodas Hashem in general is that we should be able to create symmetry throughout all the different aspects of our life. The Gemara teaches, and this is summarized beautifully by the Rambam in the 3rd chapter of Hilchos Deos, and it's actually brought down in Shulchan Aruch as well, that ultimately we should strive to serve Hashem always, everywhere. And a person shouldn't think, says the Rambam, that service of Hashem, Avodas Hashem, is something that happens when I'm in shul, when I'm learning, when I'm davening, but when I'm doing other things, such as just conversing with people involved in business, eating, drinking, sleeping, relaxing, engaged in just pure leisurely activities, marital relations, all of these types of, seemingly mundane, normal, recreational activities, which don't seem to be sacred in any way. So these are separate from our avodas Hashem. And the Rambam says that's a terrible mistake, because as Shlomo Melech teaches in Mishlei, B'chol derachecha da'ehu, we are supposed to come to understand and to know and to relate to Hashem b'chol derachecha, in all of our ways, in everything that we do. It says the Rambam, if a person can try to channel all of their life's activities through this prism, so nimtza hamahalech b'derech zu kol yamav oved es Hashem tamid. Says the Rambam, such a person can serve Hashem always, always and everywhere. And it's not just that I'm serving God in shul, and then I come home and I could sort of relax. Protocol in shul that's not appropriate, and the protocol in the home that's not appropriate in the shul. But yet, that doesn't mean that it should be such a severance between the two, and we sort of bifurcate our lives so that holy activities happen in the shul, and completely mundane activities happen in the home. Shouldn't be that way. And says the Rambam, if a person can strive to do this, Nimtzi says Sheina shelo avoda l'malkom baruch hu, that even sleep is something that can be an act of avodas Hashem. And so, therefore, this is what we should strive for. Now, why would it be that Rav Hirsch suggested and said that if he had the power, he would close synagogues for 100 years? So this is the conclusion of that quote. Do not tremble at the thought of it, Jewish heart. What would happen? Jews and Jewesses without synagogues, desiring to remain such, would be forced to concentrate on a Jewish life and a Jewish home. The Jewish officials connected with the synagogue would have to look to the opportunity now open to them to teach young and old how to live a Jewish life and how to build a Jewish home. All synagogues closed by Jewish hands would constitute the strongest protest against the abandonment of the Torah in home and life. In other words, Rav Hirsch was saying the problem is not the shuls. Like you would think he wanted to close the shuls because people weren't behaving properly in shuls, people were talking in shul. No, it has nothing to do with that. Everything's wonderful in shul. The problem is there's been abandonment of the home, that people forget that there's so much that can be accomplished at home. And so therefore, I think that this song, you may have forgotten, we're actually talking about the song L'Shov Habiata. I'm sorry to Yishai Ribo that we're not really giving him and his lyrics as much attention tonight as we have in the other nights. But the song L'Shov Habiata is a reminder that we can and we should return home, not simply, as we near the end of Sukkot, and as Shmini Atzeres tells us, Atzeres Di'alachem, go back home. But really, ultimately, this is the place in our lives where we can truly demonstrate a genuine service of Hashem. There's another Mishnah in Pirkei Avos which says, "Al tadin es chavercha ad shetagia lemakomo." You should not judge a person until you've reached his place. So this is like the expression we sometimes use. Don't judge a person unless you're standing in his shoes. And we generally understand that to mean that you should be generous in your judgment of others because you don't really know what they're going through. But there's another way to understand this. Rav Chaim Vitalitz explained, Rav Volva brings this down in the Kuntrus HaChasanim, that we are judged based on the interactions that we have with other people in our home, much more than we are in terms of what we do out of our home. Because it's natural that when we are interacting with people in more formal settings, when we are dealing with people that we are perhaps less familiar with, and we're looking to create a good impression, a positive impression. So because we are not on our best behavior. And over here, Chazal tell us, Al tadinas chavercha ad shetagia lemakomo. If you really want to judge a person, you have to be b'makomo. You have to be in his place, meaning at home. That's where you can really tell who this person is, what makes him tick. And there's an attitude that we sometimes have that if I'm in a holy place, a place of Kedusha, so then this is a place of service of Hashem. And in the more mundane and less sacred places, not. But Chavetz Chaim teaches that when Hashem appears for the first time and introduces himself to Moshe Rabbeinu, we read this in the very beginning of Sefer Shemos. So Moshe notices the remarkable scene of the sneh, the burning bush, and as he draws closer to this wondrous sight, so Hashem tells him, Al tikrav halom, don't step further. Shal na'lechem ya'raglecha, take off your shoes, ki hamakom asher omer lavan mas kodeshu, because you are standing on holy ground. And Chavetz Chaim in his parish on the Torah says, what does this mean? B'chol makom uv'chol zman yachol adam liskar v'el boro. everywhere and every time a person can come close to God. If a person can serve Hashem properly and be Mekayim the mitzvos, what is it that we need to do? We have to see to it, we have to remove the barriers, the things that separate us between us and God. And so therefore Hashem says to Moshe over here, take your shoes off, meaning you are standing on holy ground. You are in a holy place. And the only reason that there seems to be a buffer between you and me is because there is something that you have that is being mavdil between you and me. And so therefore, take off your shoes, remove the machitza mavdelas, because the place where you are is Kodesh. And the Chafetz Chaim says a person can say that always and everywhere. Wherever you are, Kodeshu. And that is the message of Shmini Atzeres. We reach this very, very, hopefully, meaningful, transcendent place throughout the period of Tishrei. The Atzeres and Tshuva bringing us to this great high on Yom Kippur, hopefully extending that through Sukkot, sitting in the Sukkah, sitting in the tzel of the Sukkah, feeling a genuine sense of connection, Hashgacha Pratis, and then we come to the end, and what does the Torah say? Stop and go back home. Go back into your house. Why? Not so you can just forget about it. It's been a good run. See you again next year. No. Because where you are standing, in your home, that is an Advas Kodesh. That is a holy place. And what we need to do is we need to continually work to remove the mechitzos, that which separate us from us and Avinu Sheba Shemayim. And so therefore, as we conclude and wrap up this series on the eve of Hoshana Rabbah, I just are going to begin our re-entry back into our homes. I recognize that in Chutz we still sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, but we're no longer going to say Leisha Basukkah. So we make a little more of a transitionary process as we make our way out of the sukkah. But we do so with the mindset of trying to figure out how to bring Tishrei into our homes. And as we return to our homes, Lashov Habaita, understood again sort of the double meaning of the word. Lashov Habaita, return to the home, and Lashuv Milasan Shuva, to return to the home, to remind ourselves that there is great opportunity in the home, that it's not only in the formal holy spaces and places, shuls and batei knesses, batei medrash. Those aren't the only places in the world in which we can find and access God. Rather, b'chol derachecha da'ehu. And the message of Sukkot is not to discriminate between one place and another, one thing and another. Zman Simchasenu is that in all aspects of life, we can learn to find simcha, to find meaning, and hopefully to hold on throughout the entire year. So that is my bracha to each and every one of us, that we should hopefully be zocheh to figure out how to package and sustain and preserve the inspiration of Tishrei as we take it back into our homes. I thank you for joining me not only this evening, but for those who've been joining throughout the last 5 weeks as we had this opportunity to explore some really, really wonderful and meaningful songs together. And hopefully we will meet again and continue to reflect upon the very, very inspiring tunes and the Torah, the very, very important values and ideas that were shared by the great inspirational Israeli composer and musician Yishai Ribo. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and wishing you all a meaningful conclusion to the Yom Tif, a good Moed, as they say, a Piska Tova, a good Kvittel. Should be a meaningful Hoshana Rabbah to everybody, and a beautiful Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah. Thank you.